Okay, I believe the recording and live streaming is up, but let's just check real quick before we get started in the room.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending the RTA's meeting of the Board of Directors. Before we begin, we'll go over our regular guidelines for our meeting. For those members who are in person, please turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and off when you are done, so we limit how many microphones are on at one time. And I'll call on those with questions or comments for those attending in person. For members who are calling in remotely, keep your audio on mute as much as possible to minimize background noise, which will impair the secretary's recording. When you have a question or comment, please raise your virtual hand. You're good at that now. And board secretary will call on members who have raised their hands one at a time. When she calls on you, please try to remember to lower your hand. With that said, I will now officially call the meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority to order. And everyone in attendance, please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Madam Secretary, will you please call the roll?
Sure. Director Indalcio?
Here.
Director Carey?
Here.
Director Colson?
Here.
Director Fuentes?
Here.
Director Gathing? She's coming. Director Gorman?
Here.
Director Groven?
Here.
Director Holt?
Here.
Director Cattell? Director Lewis?
Present.
Director Melvin? Director Ross?
Here.
Director Sagar?
Here.
And Chairman Dillard.
Present.
That is 11 present and 1 absent.
Thank you. And I think Director Gething is on her way up the elevator right now as we speak. So we do have a quorum, or will have a quorum. Item 3 is the approval of the minutes from the board meeting held on April 20th of 2023. Are there any comments or corrections to the minutes as they've been provided you? If not, how about a motion and a second? Director Indalcio moves, seconded by Director Carey, that we approve the minutes from April 20 of 2023. Madam Secretary, please take a roll call.
Director Indalcio?
Aye.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Aye.
Director Fuentes?
Aye.
Director Gathing? Director Gorman?
Aye.
Director Groven?
Aye.
Director Holt?
Aye.
Director Cattell?
Aye.
Director Lewis?
Aye.
Director Melvin? Director Ross?
Aye.
Director Sagar?
Yes.
And Chairman Dillard.
Thank you. Yes. And that is item 3 is approved. Item 4 is the public comment section of our meeting. Any comments received will now be read into the record by the board secretary. Do we receive any, Joey?
We have received no comments at this time.
Okay. And is there anybody present that wishes to speak today? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 5, which is the executive director's report. Leanne.
So I was just counting head count for the vote items just to make sure we've got 12. So good morning, everybody, and thank you. It's been a very busy month in this past month. I, the chairman, and many members of RTA staff have been out meeting with partners regionally, locally, and nationally to that point as well, to really talk about, I think mostly all our conversations are around implementing transit is the answer and addressing our big issues. We had our we've also had the mayoral transition and a very active legislative session. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And our first coalition meeting that has had provided really opportunities for us to engage with riders, civic leaders, and elected officials in conversations really about the future of transit and, more importantly, the future of funding transit. I think as many of you are probably aware, the Mayor Johnson named Chairman Dillard as co-chair of the Transition Transportation Subcommittee. And we'll touch on that in a little bit in the implementation update. And meanwhile, I and other staff members have been running around the region presenting, for example, Kane Candle Council of Mayors, to the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce, to the PACE Board of Directors, and talking with them all about the strategic plan and the critical importance of working towards sustainable funding for our transit system, and ultimately making it less reliant, our funding sources being less reliant on fares. During our presentation, actually, that was yesterday with PACE, I was also able to congratulate them in person on their recent Gold Award from the American Public Transportation Association, I should say, for bus safety. They received that award a couple of weeks ago at the conference that was held in Minneapolis, I think. The award also recognizes, the transit organizations specifically for their innovation around safety and security across their programs. So that was a well-deserved reward for PACE, and they were very excited to receive that. Last week, I was also at the International Women's Transportation Seminar, or WTS, conference in Atlanta, which is a conference of all focus on transportation issues across all modes and advancing women in those careers. But it was a great opportunity for me to meet with in person many of my peers and others around the country, sort of just talking about kind of the key issues some of us are collectively facing and get insights on how they're dealing with things and sort of exchanging ideas. So that was a great opportunity. Later in today's meeting, the team's also going to update you more specifically on some additional outreach activities specifically related to the strategic plan. Now, I just want to take a couple of minutes to provide you a bit more of a detailed look on what's happening in Springfield. So the General Assembly was scheduled to, or is, I should say, scheduled to end its session tomorrow, but it is more likely that they are going to run through at least a portion of the weekend. And just to give you a quick sense on where things are at, going into the session, our key priority was to seek an extension on the fare box recovery ratio relief. And I am pleased to note that that looks like that will happen. That relief actually is going to be granted through 2025. So that's actually a 2-year extension as it's proposed right now. We've also been engaged as part of those conversations with lawmakers on really talking about some of our ideas from the strategic plan about further expanding reduced fare programs as we look to sort of continuing to work on them and packaging them into our other funding priorities and requests. So to give you kind of the latest, go from old notes to new notes. Yesterday, the Senate passed Chairman Villavelam's Transit Omnibus Bill proposal with bipartisan support. The legislation includes the extension of the current fare box recovery ratio waiver, basically 25 and 20 years 25 and 24. That now goes over to the House for concurrence. So that means what that translates to is no changes can be made to that bill. And we anticipate that it will pass ahead of the budget. Just to give you a look at some of the elements within that bill beyond the fare box recovery ratio relief that was provided. It also is requiring that the service boards must publicly publish data related to their service availability, workforce, and safety, which is consistent with work that they are currently working to do and to stand up. So that's okay. Similar to CTA has been doing on Meeting the Moment, and they're actually looking to take that to the next level as well. RTA will need to certify that the service boards are complying with that as part of their annual budget process, or the state in theory could withhold some of the appropriation for free and reduced fares. But based on the conversations that we've all been having, and I've had with the EDs even earlier this week, that will not be an issue. So those monies will not be, we do not anticipate those monies to ever be in jeopardy. The creation of, also out of this omnibus bill, is the creation of a domestic violence and sexual assault regional transit authority public transit assistance program is what it's called. I didn't name it, but it requires the distribution of $550,000 worth of preloaded Ventra cards, $20 on each to state organizations for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. The advocacy group, the network, will participate in our Citizens Advisory Board to help support in developing a report on the administration of that program. So they're going to actually be an organization that's going to help us in that execution and that distribution of those cards. The region, the RTA also is being charged with completing a study for free and reduced fares across the region, which is actually one of the key recommendations in our strategic plan anyway. So that was on our work plan as well. The bill also includes a number of provisions for service boards. There's language mandating CTA and PACE to purchase no new diesel buses after July 26. The language also, though, includes some provisions for flexibility for the service boards in the event that there could be issues like supply chain issues for manufacturers, capacity, electrical capacity, for example, in the garages may not be able to support all those vehicles. So there are some caveats incorporated into that mandate. And there's also a process for the service boards to suspend fare cards from repeat offenders. That was an initiated by the CTA and the PACE and the bus operators union. So that is incorporated within there. There is language to provide transit to students enrolled in the One Summer Chicago program, as well as an apprenticeship and career opportunity programs for CTA, Metra, and PACE. And I can tell you that all 4 EDs met earlier this week, and we are all on board with these elements. On the budget side, a couple of things just to note. Like I said, they're probably going to work through the weekend to negotiate the final budget. A couple of the housekeeping administrative items, that cleanups that we were looking for around some budgetary stuff look to be incorporated. I think that recent revenue reports from both Gombe and others in the budget office indicate that they're anticipating some additional strains on the state's finances. So basically slowing the receipt of sales tax. And they have, that's going to be influencing, I think, what the final budget looks like. We continue to watch the budget to ensure that it contains all of our appropriations, and we'll share an analysis of the budget with you all once the final budget is passed. Staff are poised, waiting for it to drop and be able to review and make sure everything looks good, but we don't anticipate any concerns or issues at this point. There were there's 2 other bills that have passed the General Assembly that I just want to note for you today too. Representative Ma's Transportation Benefits Bill passed both chambers. It requires that all employers within 1 mile of fixed route transit offer the Federal Transit Benefit Program to their employees. RTA will be actually supporting that in terms of helping develop and identify the maps that will cover those areas, so we can make that available to businesses and others, so they know what the requirements are. There was another bill, Senator Simmons legislation, that changes the certification timeline of the RTA free and reduced fare programs. Usually what people had to do was come and recertify every 2 years. That has now been extended to a 5-year renewal on that. And we are supportive of those items as well. So that's the latest on Springfield. Like I said, we don't anticipate any new surprises. But with that being said, anything can happen. And we will keep you apprised as things develop, and we will get you a final report once that is passed. On the federal side, the FDA was awarded CTA $200 million in funding to buy up 300 new rail cars. The money comes from the Rail Vehicle Replacement Program and was announced by Senators Durbin and Duckworth and Representative Quigley. We we'll also have an opportunity to make our case to our delegation for increased operations funding, as well as other issues that we are all facing with our congressional delegation next week, when the chairman and I and Kyle Whitehead will be traveling to DC with all three service boards and leadership from all three service boards to talk with our delegation next week. So that's a good opportunity. So moving on to the next slide, off the legislative stuff. Happy to announce that the RTA is bringing back Transportation Tuesdays. That is the transit webinar series that's held on the each Tuesday in June from noon to 1. The free virtual sessions cover key topics in transportation planning as they relate to implementation on Transit is the Answer. This series will touch on ways the service boards are adapting to the changing needs of riders, trends around mobility hubs, and ways in which transit and freight interact in our region. And an explainer on the capital programming and the new capital metrics as well. Participation in all of those is free, but registration is required. So links are available on our website and will be featured in our newsletter that goes out tomorrow. So next slide, please. Today, we also begin at the board for today's agenda, I should say. We'll begin with a report from the Citizens Advisory Board's Chair, Jackie Forbes, on their May meeting. After that, we'll get an update on the plan implementation, which will include a dive into some of our priority projects for this year, which includes the work on fully funding and expanding our reduced and free ride programs. Already mentioned that. During the update, we'll also present the monthly financial update. And then what we're trying to do now, you'll see that's looking a little bit differently. Instead of just doing the traditional quarterly performance reports like we've done, we're rolling it into one presentation, and then you'll have the separate action item on certifying those financials. And then following that, we'll look for your vote on the amendment to the capital program, then a vote on approving the 2024 budget call, which is the official kickoff for our budget season. It seems like we're always in budget season, but May is the official kickoff. That work begins in earnest after that. And then finally, ask for your vote on purchase the excess liability insurance for the entire region that we do on an annual basis for the service boards, as well as an item for some expense reimbursement. So with that, Mr. Chairman, happy to turn it back to you or answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions of Leanne? Director Ross.
On the question of the cessation of purchase of diesel vehicles, you indicated that there are some exceptions out there. Who's the final arbiter on those? Would it be the RTA?
The service, it won't necessarily be the RTA. I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it's the service boards themselves, just explaining why they could or could not meet. And the way the legislation is written, there's actually no penalties associated with that. You know, it's not like there's any clawback or anything like that associated with that. So it's intended, and the service boards have, as you all know, have made commitments to moving to zero emission vehicles. They just wanted to have some language around, things beyond their control that they cannot, so they can continue to work towards delivering of those vehicles, but, not everything is in their complete control.
Thank you.
Dr. Sagar, good morning.
Leanne, thank you for the report. I appreciate it so much, but you were going through it very rapidly. So I just want to clarify from the federal perspective and the dollars, what was that level again? 250 million, was that it?
Oh, the CTA?
Yes.
The money to CTA, it was 200 million, I believe.
200.
Yeah, 200. Yeah, 200 million for 300 new rail cars for the CTA.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Great. Any other questions? Just one other thing to add on the federal side. Governor Pritzker hosted a meeting with our IDOT secretary, Michigan's IDOT secretary, as well as Wisconsin's IDOT secretary, which I attended, and members of the congressional delegation over some grant money that's pending with Washington. So we have not stopped constantly thinking about the long-term strategy on Union Station. The Civic Federation heavily involved in that meeting as well as the application. But the gist of that meeting was telling the Federal Railroad Administrator, who was here physically for a couple of days, that Union Station is not just for Chicago. It is for Minneapolis, it is for Indianapolis, Michigan, Michigan's DOT secretary really made a great case for how many trains out of Michigan, including the University of Michigan and Michigan State University, go into Union Station every day. And Senator Durbin, Senator Duckworth, and our congressional delegation, as always, are just tremendous advocates for us. But that was, a reminder to me that even post-pandemic, with our issues with transit is the answer and what's going on in Springfield, the day-to-day activities that we do in the mass transit world continue. And that was, I'm very positive and upbeat about that particular meeting. I also am thankful that Mayor Johnson asked me to be one of the co-chairs of the transportation subcommittee of his inauguration, or his transition team. Lots of meetings, and Leanne and Kyle and Tina, sometimes Jill Leary, we're all looped in. We are at the table. We'll have a hand in drafting whatever the final recommendations are to the new mayor. But very, very happy with number one being asked to do that. Our staff, it's known to the mayor's office, in the Civic Consulting Alliance and others who are really involved in the transition, that we're here to help write our pieces. To our committee, they were given 3 big submissions, and one of them was, we actually put it on one piece of paper, but there's a link, most importantly, and I'll tell my subcommittee when we meet in person again next week, they need to really link on the link to Transit is the Answer and see it. And I always love to hold it up to show how much work and how much time is in Transit is the Answer. But we're at the table, and I would say in our first meeting, our first official meeting of the subcommittee, and we have lots of meetings with the staff, have another one tomorrow. Transit is clearly at the forefront of I don't want to say it's the only issue, but we're clearly eating up a lot of the time of the subcommittee, and we go hand in glove with so many issues. I told that the subcommittee at the beginning, transit we permeate all of the other subcommittees that are there. One of the things they're talking about, as Leanne touched on, was free fares and making the CTA an integral part of the Chicago public schools and our parochial schools and charter schools as well. Homelessness, crime. I mean, transit's involved in every part of Chicago's fabric. It's important that we're there, and we are there, which is good. And I thank the mayor for, understanding that transit is critical to a lot of things that happen in the city, including the economic revival or economic sustainability of the city. Obviously, equity is an underlying theme of Mayor Johnson's administration, but our record on transit-oriented economic development is superb. I told the mayor, and he laughed when he called me to ask me to do this. I mean, I was flattered he called personally. I said, Mayor, I know where the pink line and I know where the green line are. I'm just not a red line and a blue line guy. So with the mayor and his goals, we're very much aligned. towards the things he wants to do with respect to transit. So all positive and good on that front. And it's just a busy time with lots of calls yesterday to and from Springfield. Kyle and the successors to Jeremy LaMarche are doing a great job in Springfield with the help of Leanne and the staff. And, things in Springfield seem to be going along as well as they can be. And once they adjourn, we'll have lots of meetings to get us prepared for whatever CMAP's recommendations will be for further changes under a law that was passed last year. But just a busy time, and we're off. Leanne and myself and service boards are off to Washington for 3 days next week. So just, a crazy time, but hopefully a productive time. And if you, anything you want us to stress, please pick up the phone and call us, and we'll stress it with our elected officials as best we can. Next.
Can I just, actually,
Yeah,
one quick
please.
item? I was remiss in acknowledging Anthony Safali, who has been down in
Yeah.
Springfield on the ground for days for the last couple of weeks, and he's still there probably through the weekend. So I just want to acknowledge kind of the long hours and the hard work and the literal running around that he has been doing down there to kind of keep us apprised. And it's not just working with the legislators as well. It's our team down there as well as the service boards, and sort of bringing everyone together, making sure we're all on the same page and we're right talking points and things like that. So he has really stepped up and done an amazing job these
Yeah, no,
last
he's
couple of
been,
weeks.
he's been great. And, I love, if I think you've all been around the legislature, during session at 10:30 at night. So I get the text from Anthony, or he gives you the, Chairman, can you call me if you're still awake, and those kinds of things. So he's been great. And the members, just the feedback from the members of the legislature that I spoke with yesterday, Senator DeWitt, a former member of this board, complimented not only our staff, but also the lobbyists. We forget to, we approve once a year, and we've scaled back our lobby team once the capital and infrastructure bill passed a year or so ago. But they're doing the yeoman's job, reaching out to the members that we hire them for, retain them for, to get our message out and to take input from those members. Because with 177 members, it takes a lot of bodies to have dialogue with the legislators and their staff. It's just not 177 members of the legislature. You got a lot of young, very smart, aggressive staff that also need to be touch base with all the time, just to make sure, if nothing else, they don't go rogue on the legislature. Anything else, Joey?
I'd like to recognize that Dr. Gathing and Dr. Melvin are here, and then Director Lewis actually has a question.
Yes, and let's add, no problem. Let's please, Madam Secretary, add Director Melvin and Director Gathing to the roll call, just so they're officially on there. And yes, I'm sorry, who had a question?
Director Lewis is on.
Director Lewis. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A statement and a question for Leanne. The statement, Mr. Chairman, is that train that you referred to in Michigan, which originates in Lansing and goes through Ann Arbor, also stops in Kalamazoo. So just for the record, it picks up a number of people from Western Michigan University. So I just want to make sure that was made officially part of the record. The question,
We're going to rename it the Bronco Express. We'll talk to Amtrak.
I appreciate that. Leanne, there's been a lot of conversation in the news recently about the CTA going on an aggressive hiring mode for both mechanics as well as bus drivers. Just wondered if there's any further insight into that. I know they advertise that they're having an open house in the forum. So is there any more to that other than just maybe a shortage of qualified people to operate the CTA buses and serve as mechanics?
Yeah, I would actually say all agencies, all transit operators nationwide actually are facing a chronic shortage of operators, and are all taking very sort of aggressive and proactive approaches to hiring, job fairs, signing bonuses, competitive. Obviously, they've always had competitive packages, but all of that is very much on the table. Pace is down. I was at Pace's board meeting, and they are just as a much smaller agency down to over 200 operators themselves. CTA, I think, is in the 700 range. And so they are all continuing to take very proactive steps to try to fill those spots so they can actually provide, as they talk about a lot, more predictable and reliable services and support the, the services that they want to provide.
Do they seem to indicate that might have some negative impact on their ability to deliver under the strategic plans that they have, or is it not an issue yet?
No, I mean, I think it is pretty obvious that they've all been out there and said that it has had impacts on service delivery. A driver there are either shortages of staff, they can do so much with overtime and flexible schedules, but it does present limits and challenges to the provision of services. So they have already made, this is sort of part of the continued COVID recovery that they are all sort of undertaking. They're providing the levels of service that they are scheduled to provide, but it does present challenges. If someone calls off sick, they don't have, subs and backup staff and things like that. So they continue to work to get a full complement of staff, but it is a challenging situation for all of them. We can get you more details if you're interested, beyond just to keep you kind of apprised of where they're going with all of that.
I appreciate it. No, I'm good. I just want to raise the issue. So thank you so much.
Director Lewis, this is Kirk again. I didn't want to be remiss. The president of Amtrak came in for the meeting on Union Station, Stephen Gardner, and it was cute. He had I think it was a Twitter post or a LinkedIn post. Stephen, if you know, he's tall, very tall, as Leanne says. He took a picture of himself in the restroom of whatever airplane he took back to Washington. And then next to it showed the spaciousness of an Amtrak restroom, saying, this is why you take Amtrak and try not to fly if you don't have to. But the president and our local Amtrak representatives were there, as well as Jim Derwinski, who obviously has a major interest in the future of Union Station. And then last but not least, Michael, Director Gorman and I were down in Homewood for the groundbreaking of a massively beautiful new station, which will be down in Homewood. And it was great during the actual groundbreaking. The city of New Orleans pulled in and stopped for a perfect picture background. And to see that big, massive city of New Orleans stop at Homewood was incredible. And then we were also watching one of the Metro Electric lines full up as Director Melvin and you all from the south side or south suburbs know. We were watching with interest who got on to the Metro Electric, and it was students, people with bicycles, people with suitcases, obviously going or coming downtown to go elsewhere, probably on Amtrak, and then lots of what I would call the regular commuters who work downtown, but just an amazing commercial for just the variety of individuals that take the Metro Electric and the Metro Electric's future. And I give President Preckwinkle lots of credit for driving this agenda. Really good things are happening on the Metro Electric, as any of you who represent South Suburban Cook County know. So good stuff. All right, any other things for Leanne? Item 6A is next, and that's an update on the activities of the RTA Transit Access Citizens Advisory Board. And Jackie Forbes, good morning. You'll present the report.
Good morning, Chairman Dillard and members of the Board of Directors. Thank you for your time this morning. My name is Jackie Forbes, and I am the chairperson of the RTA-CAB. I'm here to provide an update on the activities of the board. The RTA-CAB last met on April 24th, 2023. And during this meeting, RTA staff provided an update on the progress of implementation of the strategic plan's action and advocacy items. This included information on the structure for implementation of the plan, initial projects underway to launch plan implementation, and metrics that will be used to measure progress. In addition, the RTAcab was provided information on the performance of the programs within the Mobility Services Department for the full 2022 calendar year. RTAcab members provided a few comments about the strategic plan implementation. Staff encouraged members to attend the first coalition meeting on April 25th to share their ideas with them as well. The RTAcab members voiced interest in assisting with the implementation of the strategic plan, including any assistance needed to advocate for legislative change. The next meeting of the RTAcab will be held at 10 a.m. on July 24th, 2023. This concludes my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Jackie. Any questions or comments? Great. Thank you very much. Next is item 6B, and that's an update on transit is the answer, our strategic plan. Peter Kirsten, I know, and others.
It takes a village.
coming up.
So
It
we've
does
got
take a
Few
village.
people coming up.
Especially with the actual physical document. Hopefully the one I carry around at a couple of pounds, is now being frayed, and you can see my my handprints on it. Because I'd like to show it off because it's a massively good piece of work.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Dillard and RTA Board of Directors for having us here today to provide an update on implementation. I'm Peter Kirsten. I'm a program manager working exclusively on this. As mentioned, my role has changed a bit as we're pivoting to implementation. And we've also hired a second person doing the same role as me. Her name is Letitia Williams. You can anticipate hearing from her in future updates. So this is the first time, go ahead to the next slide. We're reporting on official progress implementing since this was adopted in February. So we'll start kind of by explaining a new format. You'll hear from a variety of staff today. And then we'll give you some expectations on kind of what to expect as we continue to work towards advancing the strategic plan. At several points, we will pause for questions or comments. Next slide. So moving forward each month, we'll update the board on the state of transit in our region, the financial performance of our system, and progress on growing and engaging a coalition of stakeholders to advance the plan's agenda. On months that fall on certification of financial results, that information will be provided here in the monthly update. The vote to certify coming later in the agenda. Doug will speak to this more in a moment. On a quarterly basis, staff will present a deep dive on one shared regional activity beginning this quarter with our project to fully fund and expand the free and reduced fare programs in our region. So each deep dive will include a project update from the project manager, a summary of engagement and coalition activities, as well as data and performance measures that help tell the story of why this is important or perhaps how things have changed, as well as progress that we may be making. So first up will be Peter Fehrenwald to walk through the state of transit and finance performance dashboards.
Good morning. Thank you, Peter. I'm again Peter Fehrenwald, Manager of Strategic and Corridor Planning. So as part of our performance measures program, I'd like to review our two performance dashboards, which we refreshed for transit is the answer. Next slide. So these two performance dashboards provide key information useful to decision makers, such as the board, as well as making timely information available to all of our stakeholders. These are the state of transit dashboard and the finance dashboard. Both will be updated monthly and are available on the RTA website with the most current data. Next slide. So the state of transit dashboard displays regional agency and mode service data to help assess the current conditions and trends in 4 key areas: ridership, the supply of transit service, the fare and sales tax revenues supporting the system, and the balance of federal relief funding. These 4 measures are selected to help understand the state of transit in our region as we continue to evolve our system in response to the changes brought upon us by the pandemic. Next slide. So I'll go briefly through each of the 4 measures shown on the state of transit dashboard. The first 2 are ridership and the supply of service as measured by revenue miles operated. Our ridership is presented with the recent week's data compared to the same week of the last 2 years by mode. And supply on the right, which shows the amount of service being provided, is shown similarly, but for the full month. And for each additional perspective is provided by selecting the trend tab under each graphic, and I'll show this on the next slide. So here we see ridership and supply trends for each mode over the previous 24 months. And by providing this additional review, a better understanding can be gathered for each agency and mode in the region. For example, on the ridership tab, you can see that ridership drops in the winter at year's end and returns in the spring. But it also, CTA bus and rail have been seeing a steady increase that are now at about 12% higher than the same time a year ago. Metro is having a slightly higher year-over-year growth at about 15% and pace a bit lower at 8%. So in the graph showing the supply on the right, CTA's drop in bus revenue miles reflects their schedule optimization efforts, which has aligned schedules to workforce availability. While Metro supply has an upward slope and they have added more trains in line with their regional rail approach, including recent additions to relieve Kennedy Expressway construction congestion. Next slide. And lastly, we show information on the system revenue along with the status of the relief funding. The revenue section on the left shows monthly revenue received from sales tax and fares. This is shown in a stacked bar chart to help understand the relative contribution of these two important sources over the last 12 months. And as can be seen, fares continue to be a relatively small portion of the total. And then for the status of the relief funding, we show the current percent of the total relief funding spent for the region. Again, this is our state of transit dashboard available on the RTA website. And our second dashboard is the finance dashboard. And with the information provided, it along with the state of transit dashboard, the two together adds to the understanding of current performance. So I'll turn it over to Doug Anderson to discuss the finance dashboard and performance. Next slide.
Good morning, everyone. Doug Anderson, Manager of Budgets and Analysis. The finance dashboard is also located on the RTA website and compares monthly and year-to-date actual results to budget for 6 metrics. Actual results through March, in this case, are shown by an orange line versus the budget shown by gray bars. While the dashboard defaults to show combined regional level results, there are selector buttons at the upper right to display individual service board results as well. Next slide, please. The top row shows the metrics relevant to the quarterly certifications: operating revenue, operating expense, and the resulting operating deficits, all in comparison to budget. A quick inspection shows service board operating revenues exceeding budget for the first 3 months of this year, while expenses have been significantly under budget, resulting in an operating deficit performance on the right, which is very favorable to budget for each month. We also have a tab that shows the cumulative year-to-date variance from budget, shown on the next slide. For those same 3 metrics, operating revenue and expense were both favorable to budget by more than 7%, resulting in an 11% favorable variance in the regional operating deficit. Next slide. The bottom row of the finance dashboard shows 3 metrics which do not currently factor into the quarterly certifications: public funding, net result, and the statutory recovery ratio. We only have sales tax results for January at this point, and the other 2 metrics shown here are currently impacted by the timing and magnitude of relief funding drawdowns. And as before, there's a tab to show this information as a cumulative percentage or total, as shown on the next slide. On the right, we see the regional recovery ratio lagging budget by 13 percentage points, again, just due to the timing of relief funding drawdowns. That's all on the dashboards. And again, we wanted to brief you on these new and refreshed resources and remind you that they are available on the RTA website to keep you and the public informed about the financial health of the system. Next slide. Now I'll briefly cover our standard service board financial results for this month. Although the current agenda item is for information only, this section is relevant to action item 7A, the certification of quarterly results, which will be next on the agenda. Next slide, please. As we alluded to on the finance dashboard, the operating deficit results through March continued to be very favorable to budget for each service board and the region as a whole. CTA, Metra, and PACE system generated revenue was favorable, and each service board's operating expenses were significantly lower than budgeted. A total of $66 million of favorable expense variance was driven primarily by labor savings as each service board continues to recruit to fill unfilled positions. With all operating deficit variances favorable to budget, staff recommends a finding of insubstantial accordance with budget for the first quarter CTA, Metra, PACE, ADA, and regional results when we get to item 7A. Next slide, please. Since last month's update, the service boards have requisitioned an additional $42 million of relief funding. And as a region, we have now drawn down 46% of the $3.5 billion total. We still anticipate that federal relief funds will begin to exhaust around the end of 2025. I'll now pause here for any questions the board may have on the financial results or on either of the performance dashboards before I turn it over to Kyle.
Director Gorman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you go to slide 23? I just had a quick question. Yep. No, the 7.2, 23. There it is. So it's showing operating revenue 7.2%, operating expense 7.9%. To get to the deficit 11.1. I would.
Yeah, the math doesn't seem right, does it? But the operating revenue is a smaller number than the operating expense. So the percentages are not
Out of
additive.
whack from the.
They won't add up
actual-
to the operating deficit variance. Great question, though.
Yeah, but just, I mean, you would think that there'd be a
Yep.
better visual.
If they were both the same size,
Right.
the operating revenue and the expense, then they would be roughly additive, but they're not. The operating revenue is a much smaller number than the expense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a little bit deceitful with the percentages, with the actual.
Well,
You
point.
know, I mean, it's so, I mean, maybe if there's a way to,
explain that in
Yeah,
the
right.
narrative, maybe. Okay.
thank you.
Director Groven.
Doug, in all the year-to-date charts, there's a dip for February. We don't see it in the budget. We see it in the actuals. What's driving that?
If you could go to the one of the year-to-dates.
I think 22 was slide 22 was a good example.
Well, the budget also dips in February. I'm looking at operating expense specifically there. That's as simple as the number of days in the month, 28 days versus a 31. So that's probably mostly what's going on there.
Director Gadding.
Hi, this is just a suggestion on slide 28 where we talk about the percentage drawdown to maybe add the date that we expect the relief funds to run out. Or if not there, somewhere else as part of the presentation.
Okay.
Piggybacking on that, Doug, can you give me the percentage drawdowns? Can you find out our other major legacy operators, how much have they drawn down? I'd like to see how we are doing compared to Atlanta, Philly, New York, and LA. Just to see if we're, what I think they're drawing down, especially Boston, a lot faster than we are, which is good, good for us. But I'd love to know what other big cities are if we're at 46%.
Yep, we'll take that as a follow-up. It's a good little research question. Our sales tax has been performing very well, which has helped us draw slower, which is a good thing.
I guess maybe on that comment, Leanne or any of the staff, I read that the state's financial picture in the last month has deteriorated. And I was trying to read what I was looking at in periodicals or newspapers, how much of that was attributable to our big source, which is sales taxes. But what do you think the big fall off of $1 billion or so of state revenue potential, what does that mean for us? I mean, sales taxes are our major source, but what does it mean for us to have that big drop off in the last month or so in Springfield?
So I think, not sure if I'm going to answer it directly, but I mean, one of the things, when the governor put his budget proposal out, there was actually a slight uptick in some of the monies that they were looking to provide to transit in terms of the reduced fare and the ADA side of things. They've since sort of revised that down, but it is still a slight uptick. So actually, we don't anticipate on that side of things any hit in the proposed budget that's being considered now. You know, the sales tax, I mean, that's, I think, the ongoing conversation that we'll have. We're hoping to formally kick off the budget work for our fiscal year for 24 later this morning. And then that conversation, I think, continues as we work through forecasts and things like that for what we anticipate on our side of the fence in terms of the sales tax.
Because I think most of the shortfall, it was in income taxes, both personal and corporate, but most of the states is personal. You know, I'm not a member of the legislature anymore, but inflation is going to affect clearly wages, as wages will be driven up. So you'd think that maybe over time, the income tax side of things will rise as people get raises based upon inflation. So it's just something, you know, with a month to go or in the legislative session, all of a sudden, it's like everything was hunky dory. But suddenly, you know, there's a drop off. And I know they've adjusted the budget. It's one of the things they're working on now. But to see that revenue decline for the state always gets my attention. Let's put it that way.
Well, and I think part of it was around cost for insurance programs that the state specifically has. And we can find out more, but I'm not sure if it's an ongoing thing or if it's more of a one-time sort of adjustment and going forward. So we'll include that once the budget actually passes, and we'll continue to keep you kind of apprised on the state side of things, as well as we go through obviously the work we do on the budget for our budgets.
Yes, Director Gorman.
Thank you, Chairman Diller. Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up, Doug, too, I mean, maybe, you know, in the future with these presentations, if we could show the actual dollar amount versus the percentage, just to give us the whole picture of what it, you know, actually is.
Okay.
You know, I mean, because to show a 7.2%, you know, operating revenue, you know, minus 7.9% operating expenses to come to an 11.9% deficit, it really doesn't give us, you know, the picture, but
Yeah, understood.
thank you.
Those University of Notre Dame MBAs love real numbers.
Yeah.
They love dollars in South Bend. Any other?
Director
Question.
Lewis has a
Yeah,
question.
Yes. Michael, you're on the line. That's right.
Mr. Chairman, just one quick question, maybe it was covered earlier, but the rate of spend down for the CTA and Metro is lower than it is for some of the other agencies. Is there any reason behind that? Are they better funded in other areas so they're not as reliant? I would just be interested in any background.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. You know, each agency has its own, you know, different operation and specifics. Yeah, PACE has the largest drawdown as an agency. I'd have to get back to you with a more detailed answer on that.
Thank you.
I mean, PACE also was allocated a lot less money than the other two. So, you know, it's just a real dollar situation too.
True. Any other questions, comments? Kyle, good morning.
Next slide, please.
Good morning. I'm Kyle Whitehead with RTA Policy and Government Affairs. Over the past month, we've been excited to continue to advance strategic plan priorities with partners across the region. I'll add a bit more detail to some of the updates Leanne and the chairman shared earlier and how they connect back to our strategic plan. Next slide. A few weeks back, Chairman Dillard and Leanne presented to the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors about transit is the answer, the value of transit to the regional economy, and how we can partner with the business community to achieve progress on shared goals. Leaders from CTA, Metro, and PACE joined us for the meeting and helped answer questions. Members were eager to engage in conversation during and after the presentation about a range of topics, including how service is changing and adapting post-COVID, and how the region can secure additional revenue for transit operations. As we talked about in Springfield, my colleague Anthony Cefali and our lobbying team are hard at work with the legislative session scheduled to conclude tomorrow. We're encouraged by the progress made in pursuit of continued relief from the 50% fare box recovery ratio requirement and progress made educating members about the fiscal cliff and our operating funding needs. We continue to have productive conversations with many leaders, including Senator Ram Villavalam, who heads the Senate Transportation Committee and is working on the transit omnibus proposal we talked about earlier in the meeting. Staff has also flagged several other proposals, including legislation to automatically renew benefits for people living with a disability and qualifying seniors, and to provide employees near RTA service with transit benefits through their place of work. Locally, Leanne recently spoke with the Kane County Council of Mayors about the value of transit to the counties and our advocacy and action agenda. And later this month, she'll be at the McHenry County Council of Governments annual dinner. We also presented to the PACE Board of Directors and the Metro Citizens Advisory Board. As we talked about, Chairman Dillard and Leanne and I will be heading to DC next week with a delegation from CTA, Metro, and PACE to meet with members of Congress about the fiscal cliff and a potential role for the federal government in addressing our operating funding needs. Next slide. Here in Chicago, RTA staff is excited to assist Chairman Dillard in his role as co-chair of Mayor Brandon Johnson's Transportation Subcommittee. The committee is composed of more than 30 leaders from the city's business, transportation advocacy, and social service communities. The first meeting was held last Friday, and 2 more meetings are scheduled before the group contributes to the mayor's transition report that is due out in mid-June. Thus far, the committee has discussed several topics and goals that are consistent with RTA's strategic plan. Members are eager to work for Mayor Johnson to be a champion for public transit, encouraging residents and visitors to ride. They want the city to join with RTA, CTA, Metro, and PACE in advocating for sustainable transit funding. Members are urging the mayor to have a regional perspective and recognize the positive impact Metro and PACE have on Chicago communities in addition to the CTA. Advocates are also encouraging the mayor to work with CTA, CDOT, and IDOT to build a network of bus rapid transit corridors, a goal that was featured in Mayor Johnson's transportation platform during the campaign. Next slide. In support of our legislative goals, we continue to make progress on organizing and activating a diverse group of allied organizations and transit champions. Next slide. This month, we saw the culmination of several months of planning and outreach with the launch of RTA's new Transit is the Answer Coalition. The coalition will help guide plan implementation by providing input on key projects and advocating for elected and appointed leaders to embrace the goals of the plan. First, we hosted coalition members in our building's rooftop space for a kickoff and networking event on April 25th. Civic and community leaders talked transit and shared ideas for how we can all work together to secure sustainable funding and improve the system. Feedback from event attendees was positive and enthusiastic. Although the on-site barista dishing out lattes and shots of espresso may have contributed to the energy in the room. Next, we hosted the first virtual meeting of the coalition to get into the weeds of plan implementation. Attendance was strong with 113 people joining the meeting and nearly all of them sticking around for the full 90-minute conversation. It was a diverse group of professional planners and nonprofit advocates alongside many passionate riders who want to work with RTA to shape the future of the region's transit system. The meeting included an overview of the agency's 2023 priority projects and ways for coalition members to get involved. We also had a robust discussion about the potential for the state to fund and expand the region's free and reduced fare programs. We published a blog post recapping the meeting and posted it to our YouTube channel, where you can find all of those items in the Regional Transit Update newsletter that will go out tomorrow. Now I'll pass it back to Peter Kirsten to share more context and information about the main topic of the meeting, the region's free and reduced fare programs. Next slide.
Thanks, Kyle. So I'm the project manager on this specific shared regional activity we're featuring in this quarterly project update. Again, each quarter, we're going to do kind of a deep dive on one of these projects. In the future, you can expect to hear from other project managers. So the update will include kind of a status of the project itself, what we're working on, coalition and engagement activities, as Kyle alluded to, and then lastly, kind of data and performance measures that help tell the story and measure our progress. Next slide. So the purpose of this project is to secure full funding to expand the existing regional free reduced program, to make it available to people experiencing low incomes, to make the system more affordable and advance our understanding about the barriers that fares present to riders. Next slide. This slide is a reminder of the commitment RTA made in Transit is the Answer. So this is a shared regional activity that is closely linked to the #1 goal of the plan, which is to secure increased funding for transit operations. And I'll preface my comments to follow that this presentation is developed from the materials that we shared with the coalition earlier this month, including kind of background data, information on existing programs. Lastly, I'll include input and feedback that we received from the coalition members. Next slide. So first, some background on the region's existing programs for people with disabilities, seniors, and students. These are all critical programs that connect many of the most vulnerable people in our region to jobs, healthcare, and other opportunities. They give people with limited transportation options, independence, and the freedom to move. RTA and the service boards are fully committed to sustaining them now and into the future. So first, we have ADA paratransit service, door-to-door service for people with disabilities who are traveling in areas served by the fixed route system, but aren't physically able to use it. PACE is actually the second largest ADA paratransit operator in the US, behind New York. Next, free and reduced fares. The RTA certifies eligibility for the ADA paratransit system, as well as the free and reduced fare system, which allows seniors and people with disabilities to ride CTA, Metra, and PACE at little to no cost to the rider. Income verification is done in partnership with the Department of Aging. Finally, each of the operators also offer discounted fares to students riding transit on school days. Next slide. The problem is these vital programs are drastically underfunded. ADA paratransit is federally mandated, but hasn't been appropriately funded since it was established in the American with Disabilities Act in 1990. This year, the state appropriation for ADA paratransit service is projected to cover less than 4% of the overall cost of the program. So this means local agencies are left to cover the bulk of the cost ourselves or out of general operating revenue. This is funding that could be otherwise used to support frequent and reliable fixed route service. So the lack of paratransit funding has kind of trickle down effects on service quality across the system. Next slide. The situation is similar with the region's free and reduced fare program. The state appropriation covers less than 20% of the cost of the free and reduced rides for seniors and people with disabilities. This year's budget is just over 88 million, but pre-COVID, this number was closer to 110 million. And we expect that it will get back there and continue to grow. This program is also federally mandated and linked to federal formula funds the RTA receives to fund the system's capital program. For decades, funding has always been far below actual cost. Next slide. So the reality of insufficient funding for existing programs is feeding the thinking behind our legislative strategy for how to approach expansion conversations. We need to stress to legislators that increasing transit operations funding will allow us to rely less on rider fares and instead focus on equity and impact. It's why we're advocating for legislators to begin to address the budget gap by fully funding existing programs for vulnerable riders, along with any discussion for broader expansion. These programs are popular with legislators, and the RTA and service boards are in regular discussion with leaders about them. The pending legislation that Leanne highlighted earlier, Kyle mentioned as well, in meeting is an example of kind of the most recent legislative activity. Further expansion of free and reduced fare programs could be part of a larger funding package that includes fully funding the existing programs. Such a package could, again, help reduce our funding gap while making our system more equitable. Next slide. So it's also worth noting here that this is not an exercise in examining fare policy broadly. For many who travel, transit is very affordable, and that has been true for some time. Adjusted for inflation, over the past years, there's been very little change in average fare, as you can see on the slide here. The pandemic produced some slight variance due to suspension of fare collection on buses and Metro customers changing their fare media, but overall, average fare has shown little change. As the service boards continue to test fare products, seek new ways to innovate and integrate their offerings, we'll continue to monitor how these changes impact average fares, ridership, customer satisfaction, and other measures. But this is not a direct element of the project to expand free and reduced fares. Next slide. So thinking about expansion, here are a few different ways that the program could potentially be expanded, again, as part of a larger funding package. All of these approaches already exist in other regions. Several exist or have been proposed in some form in the Chicago area. So first, there's income-based program where all people experiencing low incomes can access a free or reduced ride. The income verification process could be linked to a broadly understood benefit like SNAP. So for example, all residents of SNAP eligible households could get a 50% discounted pass. Another option is to provide free or reduced rides on select routes in parts of the region where people experiencing low incomes live and work. So here, one or multiple bus routes or train lines could be discounted or fare free to all riders. The Fair Transit South Cook pilot is a good example in our region of this approach, where Cook County is funding a program for 50% discounted rides on its Metro Electric and Rock Island lines across Chicago's South Side and South suburbs. Another approach could be providing free rides to select groups like students or youth. Many of the largest bus systems in the United States are already free for youth who are asked to show a student ID or student fare card after boarding. And then a final option is a universal or modal approach. An example would be making all bus trips free. WMATA in Washington, D.C. is advancing this strategy currently. Next slide. So with each of these, there are trade-offs to consider. And here's kind of where we sought input from the coalition. So some factors to consider would be who are the people benefiting? How easy or hard would it be to implement and manage a program? How much might it cost? How might it impact ridership and operations? So to be clear, we stress this to the coalition as well. RTA is not at all the decision maker here. Ultimately, the legislature would include this in a funding package and have input on what it looks like. But our hope is to work to help build some regional consensus around a preferred approach so that we can continue to carry that message with the legislature in future sessions. Next slide. So again, what I just shared with you was shared with the coalition and then prompted for discussion and input. I'll start by reiterating that our coalition is passionate about this topic. The meeting was an hour long with an optional 30-minute extension, and we had over 90 people that were still on the Zoom well into the extended period. Based on informal polling we did during the meeting, most attendees said an income-based program would be the most equitable. Arguments were also made for a geography-based program as an opportunity to right historic wrongs of disinvestment and to make accessing free or reduced fares simpler. Multiple attendees referred to the success of the Fair Transit South Cook program, which offers, again, up to 50% fare reduction on the Metro Electric and Rock Island, as well as pairing that with increased service on the Pace 352, the Halstead route. This included analysis and discussion of how the program has been personally beneficial to them or people they represent. As well, there was a lot of discussion around the burdens an income-based program creates in requiring people to apply and prove their income to qualify. On this topic in particular, we heard from new voices representing social service agencies and advocates. We heard real life examples of individuals missing out on benefits they would qualify for because the application process is too arduous. So as Kyle mentioned, there's a full recap of the discussion. It's going to be summarized on the RTA blog. You can also find a recording of the meeting if you want to see that as well. Next slide. So I'll pause here for a moment to see if board members have questions or comments on what we've shared so far.
Director Carey.
You mentioned, I understand there's a federal mandate for ADA reduced fares, but I think you also mentioned that there's a federal mandate for non-ADA reduced and free fare program. What are the details of that mandate?
It requires a reduced fare program for seniors and people with disabilities, and then it's tied to capital money. Although distributed as part of formula. We can share the exact requirements of it, but the current program obviously adheres with what those requirements are.
Okay, so it just says we have to have a program. It
Exactly.
doesn't say what that program needs to be.
Well, there is criteria around the programs, and we comply with that. This is not a new idea. This has been around for a while.
No.
But they also then tie your eligibility for your federal formula capital money. They don't give you any money for it. They require the program, and then they tie your obligations, if you will, for your capital, your federal capital monies to the delivery of those programs. And every 3 years, they come in and do a triennial review of us and the service boards to make sure all these kinds of programs are all in compliance to sort of essentially pre-certify you to be eligible for your other monies.
Okay. And then one other point, it would be interesting to know, to have a little more detail about what other large transit systems are doing in terms of this. You mentioned DC trying free fares. I know Boston has some couple lines where they do it on a geographic basis. You get on these stations and you don't pay. So it's just interesting to know how they do what they're doing and how successful it is.
Yep,
Thank you.
we've gathered a lot of information around that. We'd be happy to share more.
Yes, Director
Hi.
Gating.
How do we measure the success of the reduced fare South Cook program?
The RTA, I don't think has an official way that we're measuring it. In reference, I think it was advocates, members of the coalition, talking about the value it creates for their community or for them personally. So it wasn't, I was not describing kind of a formal performance measure in that, but more about, affordability. Metro has also adjusted some schedules to offer more service throughout the day, and people kind of responding on a more anecdotal basis to that success.
But specifically to the success of that program, Cook County was kind of on point with many of us sort of partnering in that work. So they're on point they've been the ones that have been kind of tracking and assessing the benefits, the impact. We can get you a summary of kind of, I think Jesse came in a while ago, didn't he? Maybe a year ago, and presented sort of an overview of the program. And we can provide you with some updates on sort of the status of that. It is set right now to sunset at the end of, and the pilot is expected to end at the end of this year.
I would,
Thank you.
piggybacking on what Jamie said, I would love to see some before and after rider numbers for Metro Electric and the Rock Island. But on an anecdotal basis, as I said earlier, just seeing who gets on and off Metro Electric, there's an uptick in activity, and it is an eclectic mix of who gets on the Rock and Metro Electric.
Director Lewis has a question.
Director Lewis.
Thank you. The conversations, did it include anything about the universal fare card program? I know in our earlier work, we had said that it would be incorporated into the forward look. And I know you put a bullet point on there about eliminating fares. I didn't know if that was in lieu of the universal fare card discussion because of the complexity in terms of working with 3 different legacy agencies, or if that was a separate discussion. So any background there would be appreciated.
Sure. So this project and this element of implementation, which is a commitment to begin this year, is very focused on full funding of the existing programs and then expanding the free and reduced fare program. Obviously, that is happening in concert with a lot of other things, including discussions around integration and different products that the service boards are testing. But in terms of this specific project that we're reporting out on today, it is strictly tied to expansion of the free and reduced fare program. It's not covering kind of broader integration topics.
Is there a plan for that to be covered later on in terms of the universal transit card program?
Well, I think as Peter just noted, that there is a lot of other work. This is not the only piece of work that RTA is doing and the service boards are doing in and around the sort of tenets of the strategic plan. So there's a lot of other work. There's a lot of other fair integration, fair policy conversations. So there's other bodies of work that are continuing to happen to begin more specifically to address that specific topic. But this actual analysis is in a way more connected now to sort of the state legislative requirements that are likely to pass. So this is just one slice. There's other work happening.
Thanks, Leanne.
Any other questions or comments for this panel? If not, thank you very much. Keep advocating. You guys are doing an excellent job. Doug, you're still there. 7A is the resolutions, are the resolutions certifying the first quarter of 2023's financial results. Any questions of Doug on this? If not, I need a motion and a second to approve this item. Director Melvin moves, so we approve it, seconded by Director Holt. And with that, Joey, please take a roll call.
Director Adolcio,
Aye.
Director Carey,
Aye.
Director Colson,
Aye.
Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Gathing,
Aye.
Director Gorman,
Aye.
Director Groven,
Aye.
Director Holt,
Yes.
Director Cotel,
Aye.
Director Lewis,
Yes.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Ross,
Yes.
Director Sager,
Yes.
and Chairman Dillard.
Yes. Thank you. That is
13.
approved. 7A is approved. 7B is an ordinance amending the 2023 to 2027 capital program. And Tara O'Malley is making her way up to the table. Morning, Tara.
Good morning. I'm Tara O'Malley, Principal Analyst in our Capital Program Department here at the RTA. I'm here to request your approval of an ordinance for a special amendment to the 2023 to 2027 capital program. As a reminder, RTA's capital program is amended 4 times a year, and occasionally we bring special interim amendments to you, our board, so the service boards can have adequate time to apply for specific grant funding. Next slide, please. First, let's review the capital program amendment. The funding for the 2023 to 2027 capital program includes changes to the approved funding and projects for CTA and Metra. PACE has no changes for this month. The overall program is increasing by $88 million, which includes both new and reprogrammed funds. CTA's program is increasing by $11 million and Metra's program is increasing by $77 million. Details of all revenue and project changes can be found in the memo in schedules 2A and 2B in your board packet. Next slide, please. In this amendment, there are $67 million in new funding being added to the program. CTA's increase primarily consists of reprogramming older CTA bonds to Blue Line projects. Metra's increase is a mix of reprogramming of state and federal funds, as well as the receipt of new federal funds that include 2 All Stations Accessibility Program grants and a federal transit investment grant. This amendment also includes the deduction of $800,000 for CTA's federal formula funds and $400,000 for Metra's federal formula funds to match the 2023 actuals. In this presentation, we'll take a look at the federal formula funds in more detail, as well as reviewing some of the new grants and projects Metra is including. Next slide, please. We wanted to take a minute to provide a quick lesson on federal formula funds. Federal formula funds are distributed nationwide to fund capital projects. Let's walk through the timeline of federal apportionments for our region. Over the summer, preliminary federal allocations are set as a part of the marks. These marks estimate how much federal funding is anticipated for the next 5 years based on increases and amounts included in the current FTA funding bill. Then, as a part of capital program development, service boards program those funds to projects and submit their plan for review, submit their plan for public review and board adoption in the fall. After the plan adoption, RTA expects that the FTA will release the final federal formula funding apportionments during the winter. Once that happens, RTA then works with Northwestern Indiana and Southeastern Wisconsin to divide the funds throughout the region first using existing allocation agreements. This action was approved by our board in this past March meeting. Within the RTA region, we calculate the service board allocations based on historic agreed upon splits. This happens through the year of 2024. And starting in year 2025 and beyond, we'll be basing those on the performance-based allocation methods. Based on the final allocation, service boards amend their program, their capital program to the actual allocations. That's what's happening this month with CTA and Metra. PACE will bring their changes to the planned program amendment in June. This year's funding estimate was approximately 0.2% higher than the actuals, which is why you see the slight reductions in both CTA and Metra's federal formula funds, as mentioned in the previous slide. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at what these federal formula funds are. There are three main buckets for the funding sources, and for the regional total, it's $741 million this year. First, we have 5307 funds, which are called urbanized area formula funds. These, which make federal resources available to urbanized areas over 50,000 people for transit capital for transit capital. CTA, Metra, and PACE are all eligible for these funds, and the total allocation for 5307 funds is $336 million for 2023. Next, let's look at 5337 funds, which provide financial assistance to public agencies that operate rail fixed guideway and high-intensity motor bus systems for the maintenance, replacement, and rehabilitation of capital assets, along with the development of implementation of transit asset management plans. Metra and CTA both qualify for these funds, which total about $391 million for 2023. And finally, we'll take a look at the 5339 funds, which make federal resources available to replace, rehabilitate, and purchase buses and related equipment, and to construct bus-related facilities, including technological changes or innovations to modify low or no emission vehicles or facilities. As it's a bus funding source, Metra is not qualified, so CTA and PACE are eligible for the $15 million in funding this year. Now let's take a look at the amendment changes this month. We'll focus on Metra as they have new grants and that we're adding to the program. As we mentioned earlier, CTA's reprogram funds are primarily dedicated to the Blue Line improvements. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the projects with new funding, we'll start with Metra's 59th/60th Street University of Chicago Station on Metra's electric line. Metra received the All Stations Accessibility Program Grant, or ASAP, in the amount of nearly $38 million. This station is scheduled for full rehabilitation, which will include accessibility improvements, platform and head house replacements, as well as new signage, speakers, and lighting. Next slide, please. Next, we'd like to highlight Metra's 95th Street Chicago State University Station, also on the electric line. This station is scheduled for full rehabilitation, which will include accessible access with 2 elevators. Additionally, there will be a full platform and stairway reconstruction, as well as heated waiting areas.
Hey, Tara, I just want to tell the members, So this was a whistle stop station. I mean, it was an embarrassment in terms of what it looked like if you ever saw it. And with the, you know, with the prodding, the good prodding of the president of Chicago State University, now they have a real station and a real nice station.
And soon to be fully accessible. Metro received is allocating $29 million of their ASAP grant to this station. Next slide, please. And finally, we'll cover Metro's battery powered locomotives. Metro received a transit investment grant in the total of $1.5 million. This project will provide zero emission locomotives for a pilot project on the Rock Island line. Next slide, please. And to conclude, staff requests adoption of the following ordinance, the approval of the amendment to the 2023 to 2027 capital program. I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we're seeking your approval. Thank you.
Any questions? Good stuff. Those are good pride. Nice report. So if there's no questions of Tara, how about a motion in a second to approve the changes here? Director Andalcio moves we approve, seconded by Director Groven, and Madam Secretary, take the roll, please.
Dr. Dalcio,
Aye.
Dr. Carey,
Aye.
Dr. Colson,
Aye.
Dr. Fuentes,
Aye.
Dr. Gathing,
Aye.
Dr. Gorman,
Aye.
Dr. Groven,
Aye.
Dr. Holt,
Aye.
Dr. Cattell,
Aye.
Dr. Lewis.
Yes.
Dr. Melvin.
Yes.
Dr. Ross.
Yes.
Dr. Sauger.
Yes.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes.
That'd be 14 ayes.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara, very much. Item 7C is an ordinance approving the 2024 budget call for the annual operating budget and 2-year financial plan and 5-year capital program. As Director, or as Leanne said earlier in the meeting, it seems like we're always in budget season, Bill, but it's all yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I'm Bill Lackman, RTA Treasurer and Budget Manager. Today, along with my colleague, Brian Lowenberg, I will be asking you to adopt an ordinance releasing the 2024 budget call, kicking off this year's operating budget and capital program development process. Next slide, please. The annual budget process begins in May and culminates in December, when the board will consider the service board budgets and capital programs for adoption. The budget call lays out the budget planning requirements. The RTA and the service boards will work through each step, leading to a comprehensive 2024 through 2026 regional budget and financial plan, and the 2024 through 2028 capital program. We will be looking for the proposed 2024 service board budgets and financial plans to demonstrate financial viability and operational efficiency, including the judicious use of the remaining federal relief funds. We will also verify that the proposed budgets and programs align with the regional goals and priorities of the new strategic plan. Transit is the answer. Next slide, please. The key components of the budget call are shown here. As the region's transit system continues to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, the general steps of the 2024 budget development process will remain the same. The regional economic outlook is the basis for the sales tax forecast used to set funding levels for the service boards, as well as for the service board's ridership forecasts. Conditions have improved since this time last year, with the ridership reaching about 57% of pre-pandemic levels, and sales tax performance remaining strong. The budget call delineates the information and statistics to be included in the service board operating budget submittals, including projected drawdowns of federal relief funding. For the capital program, the service boards will be required to provide descriptions of all planned projects and to evaluate the projects based on the 12 themes identified in the new strategic plan. Next slide, please. This year's budget cycle has some unique considerations. First, the new strategic plan, Transit is the Answer, is now in place to provide overall guidance for the budgets and programs. Second, as Leanne mentioned in her legislative update, we are now seeking to secure recovery ratio relief beyond 2025. To provide context for this, we will again include in the budget materials the recovery ratio without including federal relief funding, as well as without the various credits and adjustments allowed by the RTA Act. Third, the 2-year financial planning horizon will now include 2026, the year in which existing federal relief funding is projected to be at or near exhaustion. Accordingly, the service boards will need to identify any budget balancing actions needed to square their proposed operating plans. As stated in Transit is the Answer, the RTA and the service boards have projected a $730 million operating budget gap for 2026. The main variables impacting the gap are ridership recovery, sales tax performance, and operating expense levels. The service board budget submittals in the fall should account for the latest trends in these variables and will provide a natural update for the timing and magnitude of the expected budget gap. Finally, it is important for the service board capital teams to note that we have included in the budget call an earlier deadline for the submission of their draft lists of capital projects. This will allow RTA staff more time to evaluate the proposed projects. And with that segue, my colleague Brian Lowenberg will now address aspects of the capital program portion of the budget call. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Brian Lowenberg, Manager of Capital Programs here at RTA. Let's look at some of the highlights of the 2024 to 2028 capital program call. The capital program continues to use the service board's 10-year priority projects to reflect the agency's top capital funding priorities and to organize projects within the program. Each project in the capital program is assigned to one of the service board priorities. All state PAYGO and federal formula funds in years 2025 through 2028 will be allotted based on the performance-based capital allocation process we established in 2021. The performance-based process also requires that 20% of projects be focused on one of two key evaluation themes, accessibility or equity. Importantly, the capital program development process has been updated to include 15 new evaluation metrics that are included in Transit is the Answer. These measures are designed to show how projects are meeting the 12 themes that the capital program is focused on. We'll remind you about these themes on the next slides. The exhibit for capital submittals, Exhibit G, has been updated to include the new evaluation metrics. As Bill mentioned, a draft Exhibit G will be due to RTA on September 29th, 2023, 2 weeks before the main submittal deadline, so that RTA has time to review the service board project evaluations and provide time for feedback and updates as needed. Other elements of the capital budget call process remain the same, including opportunities for public input that are noted in the budget calendar. Let's take a moment to look at the capital evaluation themes that the projects will be evaluated on this year. Next slide, please. Capital projects will be evaluated based on 12 regionally important themes that were identified in state law, by stakeholder working groups, and by the service boards. Each theme is evaluated using either one or two metrics. The first 4 themes, as shown on the slide, are access to key destinations, equity based on residential geography, benefit to riders, and capacity, benefit, and need. Next slide, please. The next 4 themes, economic impact, service speed and reliability, regulatory impact, and operating costs. And finally, next slide, please, accessibility for people with disabilities, safety and security, climate impact, and state of good repair. We've worked with the service boards to create a guidance document on how to evaluate projects consistently throughout the region. The guidance is included as an attachment in the budget call exhibits and details each metric and possible responses. Furthermore, there are examples of projects that might meet each of the criteria. Now let me turn it back to Bill to discuss the 2024 budget timeline. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Brian. I'll now close with a summary of the 2024 budget calendar. Relevant board meetings are highlighted in light brown. In July, the RTA plans to provide the service boards with preliminary estimates of the 2024 through 2026 RTA funding levels and recovery ratios for the upcoming year. All of this as a basis for the discussions with the service board's finance teams. Preliminary 2024 through 2028 capital program funding amounts will also be included. The operating and capital funding levels will be refined over the summer. The statutory deadline for adoption of the funding amounts is September 15th, which this year falls on the day after the scheduled RTA board meeting. As I mentioned earlier, each of the service board's capital projects is due on September 29th, 2 weeks before the main budget submittal deadline on October 13th. These dates strike a balance between giving the service boards as much time as possible to develop their budgets, while still allowing sufficient time for the RTA staff to analyze and consolidate the submissions into a regional budget and capital program. The service boards are expected to conduct their budget and capital program public hearings in October and November before formally submitting their board-adopted budgets to the RTA by November 15th. On November 16th, the service board leadership teams will present their budgets and capital programs to the RTA board and field your questions. RTA staff will consider our budget and capital program public hearings, will conduct our budget and capital program public hearings and county board presentations in November and early December. Finally, on December 14th, we'll ask the RTA board to consider the 2024 regional budget, 2-year financial plan, and 5-year capital program for adoption. That concludes our presentation seeking board approval to release the 2024 budget and capital program call. Brian and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Brian and Bill. Questions, comments, Dr. Sire?
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. I think it's very thorough and very thoughtful and most appropriate. One of the things I'm a little bit concerned about, I guess, is that in the capital projects area, capital programs, you've identified the 2 primary themes for this particular cycle to be those of accessibility and equity, correct? And I would find it difficult, I think, even if I were to look 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the road and say that there's not going to be any greater themes that rise to the top than accessibility and equity. I mean, those are going to continue to be top priority themes or needs. And so what is the plan to make sure that, if you will, asking for forgiveness here, but if you dip down into some of the other themes that are not going to have the same degree of popularity, the same degree of panache, if you will, and make sure that we are staying on target with regards to developing our overall capacity. And I'm looking at such themes as capacity and benefit needs, looking at such themes as state of good repair, those types of things.
Yeah, so I think we've thought about the strategy related to this already. I think that the idea is to look at the submissions as they come in and see if there are areas that the service boards are kind of not meeting regionally and continue to address them kind of on an ongoing basis. And I think these measures will help us show that we really are doing a pretty good job at meeting them. But, you know, as we receive the submissions, we'll learn if there's any areas that do kind of need that improvement. And we'll continue to kind of display these metrics on RTAMs in the budget book so that you can kind of see the full measure of how the program meets these 15 areas or 12 areas with 15 metrics.
So it's going to be a lot of subjective consideration there then? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Well, I'll just jump in. I mean, I think that there's a collection of those 15 measures that we're trying to transparently also share with you and the public on where those projects fit, sort of how they're tracking against those collection of different measures. So it's more granular in a way than just sort of the accessibility and equity to things. We're trying to give more specifics around that. And you as a board each year we can tweak and change going year over year. It's a rolling 5-year capital program. These are the sort of guidance and the metrics that we're asking you to, we're establishing for this year. And then we can tweak and modify based on what we see in terms of how trends are going, things that projects are tracking and that kind of thing. So it's really, I think, a goal to provide sort of that open look at everything that is happening so people can actually make informed decisions and provide, and you as a board can provide us that feedback and guidance, as well as the service boards too, as they're developing their programs. So it's much more of a sort of gather that information, start to kind of organize it, and then see what that looks like for us, and we can make modifications as we go forward.
thank you.
Any other questions or comments? It's good. Brian, I'm going to use those slides to show legislators and others who think we don't think out our capital projects as well as we do with specific measures. I'm going to show them those slides and say, hey, this is a really well thought out process. And, before we approve anything, there's criteria. Any other questions? If not, we need a motion and a second to approve this item. Director Fuentes moves, seconded by Director Ross, that we approve item 7C. Joey, why don't you take a roll call if you would? Thank you.
Director Indalcio.
Aye.
Director Carey.
Aye.
Director Colson.
Aye.
Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Dr. Gathing.
Aye.
Director Gorman.
Aye.
Director Groven.
Aye.
Director Holt.
Yes.
Director Cattell.
Aye.
Director Lewis.
Yes.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Ross.
Yes.
Dr. Sauger.
Yes.
And Chairman Dillard.
Yes.
14 ayes.
Thank you. That is adopted. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. 7D is an ordinance authorizing the purchase of excess liability insurance policies by the RTA's loss financing plan and joint self-insurance fund. And Allison is available to answer any questions if anybody has any. Any questions? If not, how about a motion and a second to approve this ordinance? Director Cotel moves, seconded by Director Melvin, that we approve item 7D. Let's do a roll call again.
Director Indalcio.
Aye.
Director Carey.
Aye.
Director Colson.
Aye.
Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Gathing.
Aye.
Director Gorman.
Aye.
Director Groven.
Aye.
Director Holt.
Yes.
Director Cattell.
Aye.
Director Lewis.
Aye.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Ross.
Yes.
Director Sauger.
Yes.
And Chairman Dillard.
Yes, insurance is getting more expensive for all of us in every segment of government or the private sector. Item 7E is the approval of travel expense reimbursements. Any questions on this? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion. Director Gorman moves, seconded by Director Indalcio, that 7E is approved. And with that, last roll call of the day, Madam Secretary.
Director Indalcio.
Aye.
Director Carey.
Aye.
Director Colson.
Yes.
Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Gathing.
Aye.
Director Gorman.
Aye.
Director Groven.
Aye.
Director Holt.
Yes.
Director Cattell.
Aye.
Director Lewis.
Yes. Yes.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Ross.
Yes.
Director Sauger.
Yes.
And Chairman Dillard.
Yes,
14 ayes.
thank you. before we adjourned, the texts keep coming from Springfield. Actually, they now made the bill in the House say subject to appropriation, which Anthony says is a good amendment, I think, put on by Representative Buckner. So as we proceed here, things are moving apparently in Springfield, which is good. Any new business to come before the RTA? If not, our next meeting will be June 15th, 2023 at 9 a.m. And how about a motion to adjourn? Motion and a second to adjourn. Director Groven moves that we adjourn, seconded by Director Melvin. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, very much.